lot can change in 2 years, and a lot has changed since July 2022 when I uploaded my unboxing of the M2 MacBook Air. ChatGPT launched and changed the world. I went from 88 subscribers to 3.3 thousand. I'm about to graduate high school. So much has changed. But what hasn't changed is the laptop that's gotten me through it all. So today, as the M2 MacBook Air receives price cuts and the M3 dethrones it as the latest and greatest in its class, I'm taking a look at it one more time.
Blacked out how the other night last, maybe come around for a minute, should I like that?
First, I'll go over the spec of the model that I bought back in July of 2022. I'm rocking the base model M2 Air that everyone basically said do not buy this. It's got the dreaded 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigabyte SSD. I will say that if I could go back and save a little bit harder, I almost definitely would have upgraded at least one of those, if not both. For my use case, 8 gigs is usable. Even as a content creator, Premiere and Final Cut both run pretty well. The only time they start to stutter or I feel the impact of that RAM is in longer projects like the hour-long Meshtastic video I did a couple months ago. The main thing I really struggle with is storage. Literally every single video project that I work on has to be done off an external SSD. I just don't have the room on my laptop to store renders and project files along with my apps and my other documents. Even with the stopgap of the external SSD, I had like 10 gigs of storage left as I was writing this. 8 gigs of RAM is mostly fine for a machine of this class. That's not me saying that it's justifiable in a laptop that cost me 1,800 Australian dollars, but I'm just saying that it works. If this laptop was maybe 1,500 Australian dollars, or it didn't cost $300 to upgrade to that 16 gigs of RAM, it'd probably be fine. I don't think it would be nearly as big of a problem as it is today. The only time it really doesn't work is when I'm trying out very power user-esque tools, like running Windows VMs, local large language models, things of that nature. And even the second one, the local LLMs, they've been getting way better with minimal hardware resources. LM Studio and those 8 billion parameter models run really well on that machine. The only other time I really struggle with performance on this laptop is with Xcode. It just tanks in speed. It's barely usable, I'd say. It's honestly sometimes painful to work with compared to other IDEs like VS Code and Z. But outside of those tasks, when I step into what I've dubbed Chromebook work, like writing scripts, watching content, replying to emails, things like that, it is an excellent laptop. I've used a lot of browsers and tools for this work on this machine over the last 2 years. Brave, Firefox, Safari, Chrome, Arc, Edge, Notion, Obsidian, Coda, Craft, Pages, Apple Mail, Outlook, and even more. And every single one of them has been an excellent experience. But that's not to say I haven't had any performance issues with the M2 Air. In around December of last year, I started experiencing some major performance issues on this laptop. It's probably my fault. It's almost entirely my fault. And it just boils down to background apps and storage being used and things like that. I was able to easily solve every single issue I had by just reinstalling macOS and restoring my important documents from a backup. It's been running great ever since that reinstall, and it still runs like a champ in basically everything that I do. The only current sort of major issue that I'm having is that when I export Premiere Pro files, it has frame drops in the exported file itself, but I've been able to fix that by just using Media Encoder instead. I can't understate how well the performance of this machine has adapted with my uses. It's been through 3 major macOS beta cycles, heaps of workflow changes, tons of different use cases, and it's still holding up just as well as it did back in 2022. And yes, I will be putting it through yet another beta cycle this June. Get subscribed for my coverage of this year's WWDC. I'm really excited for that one. One thing that is objectively going to deteriorate over time is the battery. But honestly, I haven't really noticed a difference in battery life. I can easily get 2 to 3 days of use out of this if I conserve my battery and it's like mostly light work. Realistically, I'm getting around maybe 1.5 days of constant light work, and then editing, I'm still easily getting 4 to 6 hours straight in a single sitting. This is taking into account the almost 400 charge cycles I've put this thing through over the last 2 years, which has dropped the battery down to 88% total capacity as reported by system settings. And even that's really good compared to the 83% that's reported by Coconut Battery. And really, I haven't even been trying to take care of the battery. A lot of my use is just docked to a keyboard and mouse and just constantly charging at 100%, and it's still holding up really well. When I picked this laptop, I bought the midnight color scheme because I thought it looked really cool. And it does, but it is a fingerprint magnet and it shows scratches very easily. To try and avoid this on the top of the laptop, I bought this D-brand Obsidian Damascus skin, and I really like it. I bought a bunch of other stuff from D-brand, like that Steam Deck skin there. They don't sponsor me, but I would like them to. And that does a really good job of covering up the scratches and fingerprints that are on the top of the laptop. I didn't really scratch it that much, but there's a few tiny nicks in the paint that are very visible because it's that raw raw aluminium under that dark color scheme. It's a really big contrast and it shows it very easily. Unfortunately, that doesn't really help with the sides and the bottom of the MacBook. Particularly around the USB-C and MagSafe ports, there's a lot of scratches from just me missing the port a couple times a day trying to plug my laptop in. The rest of the machine feels basically as good as it did brand new. It's still rigid as ever. There's basically no deck flex on the keyboard and an extremely tight hinge that stays at basically any position I put it at even after the 2 years. One of the things I have found myself missing is that flexible hinge that both of my previous Windows machines had. My HP Omen and Alienware before this used to have a hinge that rotated to 180 degrees and just laid the laptop out flat. It just added that extra flexibility, no pun, that I really appreciate in my workflow. Not saying I miss the hinge on particularly the Omen, it was so loose, it barely stayed in position. The only issue I seem to be experiencing now is that the speakers have a little bit of distortion when they're played at max volume, but that's not really something I'm doing much anyway. I rarely notice it.
And a place to get free electricity every day, and you wake up with a full battery every day.
It's just, my car is costing me like so much money now. It's so annoying.
It's a lot.
Anyway.
I have one more quick question about this, and I don't think it says it here, but at what point do we think these,
The screen is also in great condition, as you'd expect, but there is one thing I genuinely hate about it. It is impossible to clean. I genuinely struggle to get all of the fingerprints and dust and the whatever gets caught between the screen and the keyboard, it just stays there and it is impossible to remove. I did have a matte screen protector for a while that did make it a lot easier to clean and just kept it cleaner in general, but I did end up taking it off just because I need the color accurate display. I'm a video editor. When it comes to getting any sort of work done on the MacBook, video and otherwise, it usually involves, for me at least, a lot of typing. Luckily, the M2 Air and Apple's other laptops, if you've tried them recently, have best-in-class keyboards. I've gotten very used to the keyboard on the laptop over my time with the machine. In the 15-second monkey type test, I've gotten a personal best of 150 words a minute with 100% accuracy on that keyboard. Although I will say that the keyboard definitely shines in bursts of typing for me personally. And my speeds drastically drop throughout longer typing sessions, usually evening out at around 90 to 120 words a minute. The only issue I actually have with this keyboard now is, again, entirely my fault. I accidentally spilled like a bit of Coke on it and now some of the keys are kind of sticky. And I don't even know where to start getting it replaced. I need to get to an Apple store at some point. Entirely my fault. But it is a problem. It's usually fine, like sometimes it fixes itself, but occasionally it has me looking to see how much M2 Pro MacBooks are on eBay. When this system launched, there were a few major controversies that came with it, outside of the whole 8GB base model thing. One of those was the slowest storage being used on the M2 Air. It had only one 256GB NAND chip if you bought the base model like I did, instead of the two 128GB chips that were applied on the M1 MacBook Air. In my workflow, the drive is still entirely fast enough, especially considering that most of my work gets done off a Thunderbolt drive anyway. Moving around the OS, transferring files, and just other general tasks feel absolutely excellent and don't feel at all halted by that lack of dual channel storage. The other big controversy that I can remember being huge at least was the thermal management. And yes, when I'm pushing a consistent load like rendering a video or playing a highly intensive game, it does pin the CPU at 100 degrees Celsius and just keeps it there, and it does throttle occasionally. In standard use, I've never been affected by thermal throttling to a point where I notice. Even while I'm editing, not rendering, just editing, the CPU usually stabilizes at around 60 to 70 degrees Celsius, maybe going up to 80 when I'm docked to the keyboard and monitor and mouse. This behavior is consistent across Premiere and Final Cut. I know this laptop is, again, nearly 2 years old and you could probably find benchmarks just about anywhere for it, but I figured it'd be worth running some while it's up to date with all the system updates and after 2 years of use, and just kind of give you an idea of what the performance is going to look like after you've been using it for a while. Cinebench seemed off. when I ran it. I'm not sure if it's a change in how the scoring works since the last version, but the M2 scored 454 in multi-core and 114 in single core. That's on par or worse with M1. I don't think that's right. I'm including it here because I ran that test multiple times and it was the same result each time. On battery, off battery, low power mode off. Every single test had a same, that was the highest I got. Some of them were like 404 for multi-core. I don't know what's happening there. That doesn't add up to what I see in my normal use case. And it definitely doesn't add up to what Geekbench reported. Geekbench seemed much more in line with what I expected, scoring 2591 in the single core test and 9798 in the multi-core test. This was higher than my previous review, where it scored 1918 and 8624 in single and multi-core respectively. I also ran a quick Puget Ben test in Premiere Pro, where it got a score of 1628. Alongside testing creative and just general CPU workloads, I also decided to test some games out in case that was something you were looking to do. I started with Minecraft, partly because that game and this entire idea was suggested by @TheJGamerGuy in my community post, and also kinda because it was the first game I ever played on a Mac, so it's a little bit sentimental. Vanilla Minecraft 1.20.6 at the default scaled native resolution ran anywhere between 40 to 90 FPS at the default settings. The only thing I changed was the GUI scale and the field of view. If you're a PvP guy, you'd be very happy to know that Luna Client absolutely flies on this system. With 1.8.9 and mostly default settings, just again GUI and field of view, I was getting FPS numbers way into the hundreds on a high-pixel duels match, and it was still keeping that frame rate even in the lobbies, which are usually more intensive on the system. Windows gaming is something macOS users have been trying to tackle for a while now as well, so I tried a few games in Whiskey with the game porting toolkit. I chose games specifically that were rated perfect on the Apple Gaming Wiki. At a surprise to no one, Cyberpunk just didn't launch. Well, it launched, but it could not get into the game because of that lack of system memory. Every time I tried to load into my save, it would just pin it at 7 gigs of used RAM from that program and just crash. Shockingly though, it had decent frame rates and launched pretty quickly into the menu, and it makes me think that if I had a bit more RAM, like 16 or 24 gigs, it might actually launch into the game. How well it would run after that is anyone's guess. Counter-Strike 2 did at least get in-game, but it ran at 6 FPS at the lowest settings, so not much hope there. Unfortunately, unlike CSGO, CS2 just doesn't have a native Mac version, which is annoying because CSGO ran pretty well on Mac. There were occasional stutters because it was using OpenGL, but it ran really well when I reviewed the MacBook Air at first. Cult of the Lamb was the only Windows game I tried that ran perfectly. It was locked at Ultra at the scaled resolution, and it was just locked at 60 FPS. You'll have no issues running indie/lightweight games on this machine that have been rated as perfect on the Apple Gaming Wiki. I did try Overwatch 2 a few weeks ago, but unlike Overwatch 1, it just doesn't work in game porting toolkit, crossover, parallels, anything like that, which is really annoying because Overwatch 1 ran really well on, I believe, the M1 MacBook Air even. I don't know if I need to say this, but you'll have a much better experience running games that were made for macOS, particularly those that were made for Apple Silicon. Lego Builder's Journey on Apple Arcade ran at a locked 60 FPS at its default graphics settings. Stray was a bit of a different story. It started off at 60 FPS in the intro scene and it ran really well, like it felt nice to play, until it got into the second scene and it dropped into the low 20s. I tried fixing this. I lowered the settings to the lowest they could go, I set the resolution scale to 60%, and I turned on MetalFX upscaling. That brought it up to 30, so a bit more playable but still not great. I also particularly want to highlight Switch emulation on this system because it is seriously amazing. Because of the similarities between the Switch's architecture and the Apple Silicon architecture, and because of how underpowered the Switch is, Ryujinx can basically fly through any Switch game that it supports. After the shader compilation stutters that you'll experience on literally any modern system emulator, it ran every game that I tried, 2 of them, but it ran those games perfectly at their locked native frame rate at 1080p. I tried Mario Kart 8 Deluxe first and it just worked. Like, it was 60 FPS locked, and the only time I experienced performance issues was when I tried to upscale it to 4K. I figured I may as well go all the way, so I tried Tears of the Kingdom. I didn't expect it to work, and it just worked. I was getting slightly lower FPS. It seemed to have to cache and compile more shaders than Mario Kart 8. But once it started compiling them, it was running at a locked 30 FPS, which is the native frame rate. I tried a 60 FPS mod. I couldn't get it to work. I think that's me. I don't think that's the system.
Do not know what waits below, so we need to be ready for anything. But I know I'll be okay with you, Link. Let's go solve this mystery.
The main takeaway you'll probably want to have here is that, like you probably expected, macOS is excellent on this system for productivity, even in heavier tasks like video editing. But you'll probably at least want a MacBook Pro with, I'd say, 16 gigs of RAM at least to run those heavier tasks like gaming, or even just run those productivity tasks with more performance. But if you're running a light workflow, like general productivity stuff, Chromebook work, and you want to occasionally run a light game or a Switch game apparently, and maybe get some photo/video editing done, this machine is excellent. One of the points I mentioned in my first review was that this was the first Mac I'd daily driven since about 2017. And I want to follow up on that by letting you know how my macOS experience has been switching from Windows. I really like macOS, especially compared to Windows. It just feels more stable and has a better user experience overall when you compare the two, particularly when it comes to the ecosystem features that work with the Apple devices that I already own. Using Windows with Apple devices can be genuinely infuriating. But don't get me wrong, there are some crucial features that are missing from macOS that I used a lot in Windows. Window snapping? How is that not a feature? And like I mentioned, gaming on Mac just isn't really there yet. I've been able to fix window snapping by setting up Rectangle and some window snapping shortcuts, and now I'm flying around the operating system even faster than I was on Windows because I'm just hitting a key and dunk, 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 and my windows are moved. I don't really game that much, so having a limited library on my laptop isn't a huge deal for me personally. When I do game, I'm usually on my phone or one of my retro handhelds, or if I want something modern, I've still got my Windows gaming desktop or my Steam Deck. That usually takes care of most of my gaming needs. However, I would really love to see something like Proton, or even just Proton itself, being ported over to macOS. I think it would be a major leap in the world of Mac gaming and a huge shift in the industry in general, having these affordable systems that run games with low energy and no active cooling really well. I think that'd be really cool, but probably won't happen. Another thing that seems small but is really great when using your system is the ability to run iOS apps on my laptop. That is so good. There is a lot of apps where developers have, for whatever reason, stopped them from running on macOS, like the Supercell games, most social media apps, and others. But the apps that are supported are great. I was using Shop to track my packages before I moved over to Parcel. I'm using Authy to get my 2FA codes, Delta to play the occasional retro game, and a few others. Now, of course, you know, Parcel has a much nicer macOS experience than the Shop app, and there are other emulators like OpenEmu that probably run better and have more options than Delta on the Mac. But it's nice having the seamless experience between my iPhone, iPad, and Mac without needing to change my apps, and just everything just works. And speaking of apps, I've noticed that macOS apps generally have a lot more attention to detail put into them when you compare them to Windows apps. In hindsight, this seems obvious, like just look at the Instagram Android app compared to the iOS one, but I wasn't expecting it to be literally the exact same situation on Mac. Lots of great macOS apps just forego Windows entirely, like Craft, Final Cut, Pixelmator, Raycast, and Dropover, and a lot of cross-platform apps just feel more polished on the Mac. My favorite example, Arc, figured that Apple's Swift language was so much better than anything available on Windows, they just ported it over. And other apps like VS Code, a Microsoft app, Chrome, Warp, and 1Password just feel much better on macOS. And I know this from experience. I still use Windows. I haven't ditched it entirely. And macOS just feels better, man. Even professional apps like the Creative Cloud Suite just seem to perform better on Mac and be more stable. I've been finding a lot of apps in my time on macOS, and I feel like it'd be just selfish for me not to share some recommendations with you. So I'm gonna run through these real quick. Raycast's immediate install on every Mac I get in the future from now. It's a really excellent spotlight replacement. LM Studio is the easiest way to deploy local LLMs on your system. That's also available on Windows, but it's pretty good on Mac too. It's got GPU acceleration, all of the good stuff. It's really good. Craft has some of the best UI and UX in a document app that I've ever seen, and I'd highly recommend it if you're using something like Notion just for writing. Craft is really good. Sleeve is a nice minimal customizable now playing widget for your desktop. Warp is the best terminal on macOS, period. Don't at me. It's really good. They use AI in actually useful ways, and I highly recommend it. And Carabiner is a necessity for my workflow. It basically lets you rebind anything on your keyboard. Currently, I have caps lock rebind to hit all of the modifier keys at once to make its own modifier key. They call it a super key. I have essentially just a dedicated window management key on my keyboard at this point. I hit caps lock in the arrow keys and it just drops my window anywhere. It speeds up my workflow a heap. And keeping on the app topic, I still use Premiere to edit, but Final Cut is so much nicer. That whole the playhead sticking to the mouse cursor is just, although it does get really annoying when really niche apps just don't run. Like I was trying to put a GBA game onto my 3DS that I couldn't find a .cia file for. I own the game, trust me guys. And I tried to run a virtual console injector, which basically puts the GBA game into virtual console. It runs better than most emulators on the 3DS. And they aren't available for Mac, and I couldn't get them to run in Wine through Whiskey and other tools, which was really annoying. And because I've got that base model, I don't have enough storage to justify a Windows VM just for things like that. But otherwise, in general, the app situation on macOS, 10 times better than Windows, 100 times better. It's also slightly annoying that there isn't a native way to hide items in the menu bar. Like Bartender's pretty good, but a native solution would just work a lot better, and it'd be nice not to have to pay. It stopped the recording. Where was I? ext4. I think ext4 should be supported. It's open source. It shouldn't need to pay licensing, and there are apps for it, but they're a bit dodgy. But otherwise, I really don't have that many critical complaints about macOS. So, it's been nearly 2 years. Do I still recommend the M2 MacBook Air? There's a few things to consider. First, keep in mind that, it's 2 years old now. It's not going to be supported as long as a brand new machine. And I find it hard to believe that tools like OpenCore Legacy Patcher are going to work as well as they do on Intel Macs when they're brought over to Apple Silicon, if they ever make it over to Apple Silicon, because of those security features. However, this is still an excellent system that runs really nicely in my workflow. If you have a workflow like mine, something that couldn't run on a Chromebook but doesn't really need a Pro machine, you're going to love this laptop. You can get this machine brand new from Apple for around 1,600 Australian dollars or 2,200 if you splurge for 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. But you also have the benefit of the used market. Again, this device isn't brand new. I've seen this specific model on the Australian used market sell for around 1,200 Australian dollars. And you might be able to get a decent deal if you scour the Apple refurbished store if you don't trust sites like eBay. I recently saw some 15-inch base models with M2 for around 1,700. That's $100 more than a brand new M2 Air, and you get the 15-inch screen. And while I haven't used it personally, the M1 Air is getting even cheaper. I know Walmart had that $700 US deal for one, which is just insane. And I'm seeing refurbished M1 systems on the Apple refurb store in my location for around 1,200 Australian dollars. There's even this insanely spec'd machine with 8 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage for just over $2,100. Even if you end up buying brand new, I'd still recommend this machine. Just don't get the base model if you need anything more than Safari. And that's about it. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you know what button to hit, and if you really like this video, maybe even hit subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and basically everything else using the links on screen and in the description below for upcoming previews on new reviews and my thoughts on basically everything. If you want more videos, you can click over here to check out that time me and my friend tried to make a makeshift cell network and it actually worked, or you can click over here to check out something the algorithm thinks you'll like. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.